The men left before sunrise. 4 of them, moving single file through snow that came past the knee in places, and above it in others. Harlan Decker led the way because he knew the trail better than anyone, and because, if he was honest, he felt partly responsible. He had been the one who said, back in October, that Ruth Calloway would not last the winter alone. He had said it the way a man says something he believes is true and kind at the same time. Now it was February, and the temperature had not climbed above 12 degrees Fahrenheit in 11 days, and the blizzard that had shut the valley for the past 4 nights was only now beginning to ease. The road to Ruth's property had been buried since Thursday. No smoke had been visible from the ridge since before the storm. No one said what they were expecting to find. They did not need to. Harlan's dog, a gray shepherd named Burl, moved ahead of them without being told, nose low, reading something in the air that the men could not. When the cabin came into view through the thinning snow, all 4 of them stopped walking at the same moment. There was smoke, not the weak, intermittent thread of a fire someone had managed to keep alive by burning furniture. A steady column, thick and unhurried. The kind of smoke that comes from a stove that has been fed properly and left to do its work. And then, as they came closer, the smell reached them. Bread. Harlan looked at the man beside him. The man looked back. Neither of them spoke. They knocked on the door of a cabin that was, by any measurement they could apply, warmer inside than any structure in the valley had a right to be after 4 days of that storm. Ruth Calloway opened the door in an apron, holding a dish towel, and looked at the 4 snow-covered men on her step the way a woman looks at people who have arrived unexpectedly for a meal she has already prepared. She said, "I was wondering when someone would come check." She said it without sarcasm, without triumph, the way a person says something that is simply true. What happened inside that cabin during those 4 days, and in the weeks of hard work that came before them, is a story about observation, patience, and one woman who paid attention to something small that everyone else had walked past for years. It is not a miraculous story. The physics involved are not mysterious, but the courage required to trust what she had seen, to act on alone with the material she had and the time she had left, that part is harder to explain. Harlan Decker stood in the doorway for a long moment before he stepped inside. He would later tell people that the warmth hit him like something physical, like walking out of shadow into sun. He did not tell people what he thought in that moment. But Burl walked straight to the hearthstone, circled once, and lay down against it with a long exhale. Even the dog knew. If you are watching from somewhere cold tonight, tell us where you are in the comments. Stories like this survive because people still care enough to remember them. And if this kind of frontier wisdom matters to you, subscribing helps keep it alive. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice. Ruth Calloway had lived in that valley for 19 years, and in that time the valley had formed opinions about her the way water forms opinions about stone, slowly, without asking permission, and in ways that are difficult to revise. She had come there with her husband, Thomas, in the spring of 1871, when the land was cheap because the previous owner had broken his back trying to farm it and sold at a loss. Thomas was not a farmer by training. He was a millwright, a man who understood how water moved through wood and stone, how force could be redirected and stored. He had looked at the property slope, at the creek that ran along its northern edge, and seen something the previous owner had not. Within 3 years, the farm was producing. Within 5, it was one of the quieter successes in the county. Thomas died in September of 1873, not dramatically, a fever that lasted 10 days, and then did not stop. Ruth sat with him through the last 4 nights and buried him on the hillside behind the cabin, under a stand of cottonwood that had been his favorite place to sit in the evening. She was 53 years old. Her daughter, Margaret, lived in Salina, 2 days' ride east, and had written 3 letters in October alone urging her mother to come before the snow closed the roads. Ruth had replied to each one in the same careful handwriting, saying she appreciated concern and would consider it seriously. She did not go. The valley understood this, in the way valleys understand things, which is to say that people talked about it. The consensus was sympathetic, but firm. A woman alone on that property, with Thomas gone and the cabin not fully repaired from the damage it had taken the previous spring, was a woman in a situation that would not end well. Harlan Decker, who ran the largest spread in the lower valley and who had known Thomas since before the war, said in October that Ruth would not last a winter. He meant it as concern. He said it quietly. It spread the way quiet things spread in small communities, which is to say everywhere and quickly. What the valley did not know, what no one knew, because Ruth had not told anyone, was that she had spent the first 3 weeks after Thomas's funeral not grieving in the way they imagined, though she did grieve, but observing, moving through the cabin and the property at all hours, paying attention to things Thomas had always handled and that she had always trusted him to understand. She noticed in those weeks that the cabin had a problem no one had ever bothered to name. Heat left it too quickly, not because the fire was poor or the wood was green. Thomas had always kept good wood, split and stacked under the lean-to on the south wall, and Ruth continued his habit. The stove was old but functional. The problem was elsewhere, in the walls, in the way the coal came back every night, as if it had been waiting just outside the logs of fire to lose its strength. Most people accepted this as the nature cabins. Ruth accepted it as a problem that might have a solution. She did not yet know what the solution was, but she had noticed where the cold entered and where it did not. She had pressed her hands against different sections of wall at different hours. She had watched where frost formed first in the mornings and where it formed last. She had, in those weeks of grief and solitude, begun to pay a very particular kind of attention. And in one corner of the cabin, near the old stone that Thomas had set years ago as a kind of informal hearth extension, she had noticed something she could not yet explain. The stone stayed warm longer than anything else in the room. Not hot, not even warm enough to be comfortable to the touch by morning, but measurably, unmistakably warmer than the log walls, the packed dirt floor, and the air itself. She had pressed her palm against it on a morning in early October, when the temperature outside was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, and the fire had been out for 4 hours. The stone still had something left. She did not know yet what to do with that observation, but she did not forget it. And in a winter that was coming faster than anyone had planned for, forgetting the right thing at the right moment was the only kind of mistake Ruth Calloway could not afford. Anyone who walked through Ruth Calloway's cabin in November of 1873 and was asked to assess its chances of carrying one woman through a hard plains winter would have said, if they were being honest, that the chances were not good. The structure itself was sound enough in a way that frontier cabins of that era were sound, built to function, not to last forever, with the understanding that a man with skill and time would make improvements as the years allowed. Thomas had made improvements. The roof had been rechinked in 1872. The floor near the door had been repaired after the creek flooded in April. The stove, a cast iron box stove of common design, had a new collar fitted to the flue pipe the previous spring. But the wall on the north side had developed a slow separation between 2 of the upper logs, a gap that Thomas had planned to address before winter and had not. Through that gap, in a strong north wind, a man could push 2 fingers into open air. Ruth had stuffed it with rags and river clay in October. The clay had dried and partially crumbled by November. She stuffed it again. It held better the second time, but she knew it was a temporary answer to a permanent problem. The firewood situation was more serious. Thomas had always kept 4 full cords stacked and seasoned before October. He had died in September, when the wood was only partially cut. Ruth had spent 6 weeks after the funeral cutting, splitting and stacking with a maul she had never used before Thomas's death, and that raised blisters on her palms for the first 2 weeks. She had, by the end of October, accumulated 2 cords and perhaps a quarter more. Experienced neighbors would have called it insufficient for a cabin with that north wall gap, burning with the rate a standard stove required to hold heat through a genuine plains blizzard. 2 1/4 cords was a number that did not reach the end of February in any calculation she had worked through. She had worked through it many times. The stove itself burned efficiently when fed correctly, but it was a direct heat system. It warmed the air in the room while it burned, and when the fire dropped, the air temperature dropped with it, often within the hour. This was not a flaw in the stove. It was the nature of the thing. Cast iron holds some heat after the fire dies, but not much and not for long. The room that was 62 degrees Fahrenheit at 9 in the evening could be 34 degrees by 3 in the morning if the fire was not maintained. Maintaining a fire through the night meant feeding it every 2 to 3 hours. Feeding it every 2 to 3 hours meant waking every 2 to 3 hours. Waking every 2 to 3 hours through a 4-month winter meant arriving at spring in a state of exhaustion that carried its own dangers. Thomas had done the night feedings for 19 years. Ruth had slept through them, trusting the system without knowing its cost. She understood the cost now. What she had, in November of 1873, was a cabin with a compromised north wall, with supply that would not reach spring under normal burning patterns, a stove that heated well but held nothing, and a winter that the old-timers in the valley were already calling likely to be the worst in a decade. Harlan Decker had started his preparations in August. The Sorensen family, 3 miles east, had brought in 6 cords and a second stove. What Ruth Calloway had was less than half of what she needed by every conventional measure. And the stone in the corner. She had not stopped thinking about the stone. The stone Thomas had set in the corner of the cabin was not remarkable to look at. It was a flat-sided piece of limestone, roughly 18 inches across and perhaps 10 inches thick, that Thomas had dragged in from the creek bank sometime in the first years and positioned near the stove as an informal platform for the iron kettle. It served no architectural function. It was simply a surface he had found useful, the way a man accumulates useful surfaces over years in a working cabin. Ruth had looked at it every day for 19 years without thinking about it. What changed in October was not the stone. What changed was that Ruth began waking before the fire did. In the weeks after Thomas's death, her sleep was disordered. She woke at 2, at 3, at 4 in the morning, in a cabin that was cooling and quiet. Instead of feeding the fire and returning to bed, she began to sit with the cooling room. She did not do this intentionally. She did because sitting was easier than lying awake in the dark, and because the cabin at those hours had a quality she had not noticed before. It did not cool evenly. The air near the window cooled first and fastest. The floor near the door was coldest before dawn. The west wall, which faced the prevailing wind, lost its warmth within an hour of the fire going down. But the corner with the stone was different, not dramatically, not in any way a person in a hurry would notice. Ruth noticed it because she was not in a hurry. She was a woman with nowhere to be at 3 in the morning, sitting in a cooling room, pressing her hands against different surfaces the way a person presses against a wound to understand its extent. The stone, for hours after the fire had gone to coals, still held something the wood walls did not. She pressed her palm flat against it for a full minute, the way Thomas had taught her to test the temperature of a flat iron. Not a quick touch, but a sustained contact, letting the heat speak slowly. There was warmth there, not comfort warmth, not warmth you could bathe in, but warmth that was measurably above the air around it, above the floor beside it, above the log wall 2 feet to its left. She did this on several mornings before she began to understand what she was measuring. The stone was not generating heat. It was the last place in the room still giving back what the stove had put into it hours before. The air and the wood had already released everything. The stone was still paying out. Ruth sat with this for a long time. She thought about the creek in August, how the water stayed cold even in the hottest afternoons, because the stones beneath it held the cold of the night long past sunrise. She thought about the bread she put on the stone each morning to warm, how it stayed warm longer there than on the wooden shelf. She thought about Thomas, who had spent his working life studying how things held and released force, and who had never, to her knowledge, made the connection she was making now in the dark at 3 a.m. She thought more stone would mean more of this, not more heat, more time. If the stone could hold the stoves warm for 4 hours after the fire dropped, more stone might hold it for 6 or 8 or 12. The fire would still need feeding, but perhaps not every 2 hours. Perhaps not every night, she thought. If the fire needed feeding every 4 hours instead of every 2, the wood would last nearly twice as long. She thought, 2 1/4 cords might be enough after all. She sat on the floor of the cooling cabin with her back against the warm stone and worked through the arithmetic slowly, the way Thomas had taught her to work through things that mattered, not quickly, not optimistically, with the same patience she had watched him apply to every problem that needed solving and not just surviving. By the time gray light came through the window, she had decided what she was going to do. She was going to need more stone. The creek had frozen at the edges by late October, but the center still ran, and the limestone slabs that Thomas had always said were the best building stone in the county lay where they always had along the western bank, half buried in the mud and frozen grass. Ruth spent the first 3 days hauling stone. She used a small wagon Thomas had built for moving split wood, the one with the wide flatbed and the iron-banded wheels, and she made 7 trips to the creek in those 3 days, loading slabs that weighed between 40 and 90 pounds, and that required her to use a pry bar and her full body weight to break them free from the ground. Her back hurt by the end of the first day. Her hands, already rough from the wood cutting, split at 2 knuckles and took until the following morning to close properly. She did not stop. The plan she had formed before dawn on that October morning was not complicated in concept, though it was demanding in execution. She intended to build what she thought of as a stone wall inside the existing cabin, set against the interior face of the north wall where the gap was, extending from the floor to a height of roughly 4 feet, packed with the same river clay she had used on the gap itself. The stone would serve 2 purposes. It would seal the north wall more thoroughly than the rags and clay she had already used, and it would provide the cabin with a large thermal body that would absorb heat from the stove during the day and release it slowly through the night. More stone, more time. That was the entire theory. It was Harlan Decker who first saw what she was doing. He had come to check on her in the first week of November, partly out of genuine concern and partly, she suspected, to see whether she had yet decided to go to her daughter's. He found her inside the cabin, fitting a limestone slab into the lower course of what was, by then, a wall in progress, 3 feet long and 2 feet high, chinked with river clay and set plumb against the north logs with a care that surprised him. He stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Ruth, what in the Lord's name?" She explained it to him as clearly as she could. The stone holding heat, the slow release, the wood calculation. He listened the way a patient man listens to something he thinks is wrong, but does not want to say is wrong too quickly, which is to say he listened with his hat in his hands, and his weight shifting slowly from one foot to the other. When she finished, he said it was a lot of work for an idea that might not amount to much. He said stone walls belonged on the outside of structures for a reason. He said the mass of all that limestone was going to make the floor settle. He said that if the winter was as hard as the old-timers were saying, what she needed was not a wall of rocks, but a second stove and enough wood to run it. He was not trying to be unkind. Everything he said had logic in it. Ruth knew this. She told him she appreciated his concern. She did not tell him she was going to keep building. After he left, she stood in the cabin looking at what she had built so far. It was not beautiful, The courses were uneven where she had been unable to find stones of matching thickness. The clay had dried in some places and was still wet in others. It looked, she admitted to herself, like something a person had built because they had no other choice, which was precisely what it was. She pressed her palm against the finished section. The clay was still setting. The stone held the ambient temperature of the room. Nothing more. It had not yet been asked to do anything. She thought, I will not know if I am right until it gets cold enough to test. The first hard frost came 4 days later. She worked through it, adding courses, hauling more stone, repacking clay where the drying had opened small cracks along the joints. She did not yet know that the cracking was trying to tell her something important. The wall was finished on the 14th of November, 7 courses high at its tallest point, running the full length of the north wall from corner to corner, 4 feet at the peak and tapering at the ends. Ruth had used just over a ton of limestone, by her rough estimate, and something close to 3 full buckets of river clay worked with water to the consistency of thick porridge. She stood back and looked at it on the evening she finished and felt, for the first time since Thomas's death, something that was not quite hope but was adjacent to it. The first real test came 2 nights later, when the temperature dropped to 8 degrees Fahrenheit and a wind came out of the northwest that found every gap in every structure in the valley. Ruth banked the stove at 10 o'clock and went to bed without feeding it further, which was not a thing she had ever done in winter, without Thomas awake to tend the night. She woke at 2 in the morning to a cold room, not dangerously cold, not the kind of cold that meant emergency, but colder than she had hoped and colder than the theory had promised. The thermometer Thomas had hung on the interior wall read 41 degrees Fahrenheit. She had hoped for something closer to 50. She built the fire back and sat beside it in the dark and tried to understand what had happened. She went to the wall. She pressed her hands along it, section by section, the way she had learned to do in the weeks of waking before dawn. The lower courses, the ones closest to floor, were warm, warmer than the air, warmer than the log wall to their right. But the upper courses, the ones she had laid last and fastest, were nearly as cold as a room. She pressed harder. She moved her hands slowly, and then she found it, along the upper third of the wall. In 3 separate places, the clay had cracked, not superficially, the way drying clay always develops hairline marks on the surface, but deeply. She could push a fingernail into the gaps. In one place, near the eastern end, she could feel cold air moving through a crack when she held her hand close. The stone was not the problem. The stone had done what she had expected. The lower courses were holding heat from the stove, absorbing it through the day and paying it back slowly through the night. But the cracks in the upper clay had broken the wall seal, and cold air was moving through the north logs and into the back of the stone instead of being stopped by it. She was not storing heat as efficiently as she had calculated. She was storing heat on one side of the wall while losing it through the other. The wall had 2 jobs, to store warmth and to block cold. In its upper third, it was doing neither. She stood at the cracked section for a long time in the dark, with the rebuilt fire throwing shadows across the uneven limestone courses, and she felt the particular weight of a woman who has spent 6 weeks of hard physical work on a theory that has just come partly apart. Partly, she kept thinking, not entirely. The lower courses were working. The heat was there, in the stone, doing what she had intended. The problem was not the concept. The problem was the execution. The problem was the clay and what she had used it for, and where she had used it. She thought about what Harlan Decker had said. She thought about her daughter's letters. She thought about the wood stacked under the lean-to and how many nights it could reasonably carry her. Then she went to bed, and in the morning she went back to the creek for more clay. The problem with the upper clay, Ruth determined over the following 3 days, was not the clay itself. It was the stone she had used to back it. The lower courses of the wall were built from the flat, dense limestone slab she had spent the most time selecting at the creek, pieces that were heavy and close-grained and held their shape under pressure. The upper courses, which she had laid in the last 2 days when her energy was lowest and the light was shortest, were made from whatever stone she had been able to bring in quickly, a mix of limestone, some softer sandstone, and 2 pieces of what she now suspected was a more porous material that had absorbed the clay differently as it dried. The porous stone had shrunk unevenly. The clay, trying to adhere to a surface that was pulling away from it, had cracked rather than settled. She chipped out the upper 3 courses entirely. It took most of a day. Then she went back to the creek and spent 2 days finding only the dense, flat-sided limestone, turning away stones that had any softness or visible grain, selecting with a care that she had not applied the first time, because the first time she had been trying to finish before the hard cold came. The hard cold had come anyway. She built more slowly now. The new clay mix was also different. She had found, in the riverbank 20 yards upstream from where she had been working, a section of true clay, the kind that potters used, darker and more plastic than the surface clay she had used before. She mixed it with fine sand from the creek bed, 1 part sand to 2 parts clay, and the resulting material packed into the joints with density that felt, under her fingers, fundamentally different from the first batch. She rebuilt the upper 3 courses over 4 days. She also made a change she had not originally planned. Near the center of the wall's upper section, she left a deliberate void, a space between 2 large slabs, roughly 8 inches wide and 12 inches tall, that opened toward the stove side of the wall. It was not a hole. It was more like a channel, packed loosely on the outer face but open on the interior face, designed to let the warmed air from the stove's immediate vicinity flow into the body of the wall itself, rather than relying only on radiant heat to charge the stone. She had observed, in the weeks of pressing her hands against different surfaces, that the stone warmed faster when air could move against it than when it simply sat at a distance from a heat source. The stove warmed the air, and the air warmed the stone, and the stone held what the air had already given up. But the air could move into the wall, through the void and contact more surface area. The charging would go deeper and last longer. It was not a sophisticated concept. It was an observation followed by an adjustment. Thomas would have recognized the logic immediately. He had spent his working life doing exactly this, watching how things moved, and then giving them a better path to move along. She packed the outer face of the void loosely with dry grass and sealed it with a thin layer of the new clay, which would let some air pass while preventing cold from entering from the outside. It was the 15th of November when she finished the second version of the wall. She pressed her hands along its entire length, section by section, standing in the afternoon light that came low and orange through the west window. It felt different, denser, more solid under the palm. The joints were tight. The new clay had already begun its first dry, and it was not cracking. She felt, in that moment, something Thomas had described once about the work he did with mill wheels, the difference between a thing that looks finished and a thing that is finished. The feel, he said, was unmistakable. She thought he was right. The first real test of the repaired wall came 3 days later, in a cold snap that brought the temperature to 4 degrees Fahrenheit by midnight. She banked the stove at 9 in the evening. She did not wake at 2 to rebuild it. She let herself sleep. She woke at 5 in the morning. The room was 48 degrees Fahrenheit. She lay in bed for a moment without moving, doing the arithmetic. 5 in the morning. 8 hours since she had banked the stove. 48 degrees inside. With 4 degrees outside and a north wind, she could hear testing the eaves. She got up and pressed her hands against the stone. The wall was warm. Not hot. Not even warm enough to be comfortable for long. But warm in a particular steady way that has nothing to do with fire and everything to do with stored time. She went to build the fire, and for the first time since October, she did not feel as though she was racing something. January came in gently, which the old-timers said was a bad sign. A gentle January on the Kansas plains often meant that winter had not spent itself yet, that it was accumulating something further north and would arrive with all of it at once before February was done. Harlan Decker said as much at the general store in the second week of January, and the men who had been to the winter of 1857 nodded, without speaking. Ruth spent January feeding the wall. That was how she had come to think of it, not heating the cabin, but feeding the wall. The stove ran during the day, and the wall charged, and when the fire dropped in the night, the wall paid what it owed. She was sleeping through until 4 or 5 in the morning. Her wood consumption had dropped by something she estimated at between 30 and 40% compared to the winters when Thomas had tended the fire every 2 hours. She could not be precise about the number. She only knew that the stack under the lean-to was holding in a way she had not dared expect in November. The wall had also changed the character of the cold in the room. This was harder to explain, but she felt it clearly. The stove's heat had always been uneven, warm near the stove, cooler toward the walls, coldest near the floor. The stone wall held its warmth more evenly, releasing from a wide surface rather than a single point, and the room's temperature had become more consistent as a result. The corners were no longer the punishing cold places they had been in previous winters. The floor, which had always been the first thing she felt when she got out of bed in the dark, was no longer a shock. She thought, Thomas would have had a name for what this is. He would have understood the principle immediately and been able to explain it to her properly, in the language of his trade. She thought, I understand the principle. I just arrived at it from the other direction. The blizzard came on the last day of January. She knew it before it arrived. The sky to the northwest had been a particular shade of yellow-gray since mid-afternoon, a color she had seen before and did not mistake for anything other than what it was. She spent the last 2 hours of light doing everything that needed to be done outside, breaking ice on the water barrel, moving the remaining wood from the back of the lean-to to the front where she could reach it without fighting snow, checking the latch on the small shelter where she kept the 2 remaining hens. She was inside by 4 o'clock. The wind came first. Not the blizzard itself, but the wind that precedes it. The wind that finds every imperfection in every structure and reminds of the fact. She heard it find the north wall. She heard it test the eaves and the chimney and the corner joints where the logs had settled unevenly. She heard it find the gap she had repaired in October, now sealed behind the stone wall, and she heard it fail to get through. The snow came an hour after the wind. By 7 in the evening, the storm was full, and the temperature had dropped to something she could not read precisely because the thermometer stopped reliably below its lowest mark, which was 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Ruth banked the stove at 8. She had fed it well through the day, a long, slow burn that had the stone wall radiating heat she could feel from 3 feet away. The fire she left was not large. It was enough to keep coals, enough to let the damper stay cracked and the flue clear. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the blizzard work in the cabin, and she thought, in the careful way she had been thinking since October, about what might still fail: the repaired clay joints, the void in the upper wall, the lean-to, which was not attached to the main cabin, and whose roof was carrying more snow than she had been able to clear before the light failed, the hens in their small shelter. She thought about Harlan Decker's house, which was larger and better supplied than hers, and which had 2 stoves and a man who could wake at 2 in the morning to tend them. She thought about her daughter, Insulina. She thought about Thomas, who had set that piece of limestone in the corner of the cabin, not because he understood what it would one day do, but because he needed a surface for the kettle, and the stone was the right size and the right weight, and he had carried it in from the creek one afternoon and put it where it seemed to belong. She thought, sometimes the right thing is already there. You only have to notice it. She slept. The blizzard did not care. It ran for 4 days. On the morning of the 4th day, the storm eased. Ruth woke at 5:30 and lay still for a moment before getting up, listening to the quality of the quiet. The wind had dropped. Not entirely, but enough. She could hear underneath it, The particular silence of deep snow, a silence she had known since childhood, and that meant the worst had passed. She got up into a room that read 46 degrees Fahrenheit on the thermometer. For days, she had fed the stove twice each day, a morning burn and an afternoon burn, and had let it drop each night. She had slept through every night. She had not once woken to an emergency. The wall had done its work in the slow, unhurried way of dense objects holding what has been given to them. Not spectacularly, not miraculously, but reliably, the way good material always performs, which is without needing to be praised for it. She built the morning fire. When it was drawing well, she mixed bread. She mixed bread because she had flour and because she was hungry and because there was nothing else that needed doing that could not wait until the fire had fully charged the room. She mixed it in the clay bowl Thomas had bought from a German potter in Abilene in 1872, and she set it to rise near the stove while she went to check on the hens. The hens had survived. The lean-to roof had held. The snow was past the top of the door on the north side and would require digging out. But that was a task for later. She came back inside and set the bread. By the time Harlan Decker and his 3 men appeared at the edge of her property, moving through knee-deep snow in the gray February morning, the bread was out of the pan and cooling on the limestone by the stove. She heard them before she saw them. Burl, Harlan's dog, gave one short bark as they came to the last stand of cottonwood, and Ruth went to the window and watched them move through the snow and understood immediately what they were doing and why. She had expected someone to come. She had not expected 4 of them, or a particular set of their shoulders as they walked. The set of men who have prepared themselves for something difficult and are holding that preparation carefully against the cold. When she opened the door and they stood in the snow looking at her, she felt a complex thing that she did not try to name. Not triumph. Something older than triumph. Something closer to the feeling a person has when a calculation they made alone in the dark, in a cold room, with no one to confirm it, turns out to have been correct. She said, "I was wondering when someone would come check." Harlan came inside first. He stood in the center of the cabin with his hat in his hands and his coat still on, and looked around the room the way a man looks at something he had decided would be one thing and is found to be another. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he walked to the stone wall. He took off one glove. He pressed his bare hand flat against the limestone. He held it there. Ruth watched him. She did not offer an explanation. She had spent enough of the past months explaining to people who had decided in advance that she was wrong. He said finally, "It's still warm." She said, "It was warmer an hour ago." One of the other men came in and stood behind Harlan. Then the other 2. They were all looking at the wall, at this unbeautiful thing that Ruth had built by herself from creek stone and river clay during 6 weeks of hard October work. This wall that no carpenter would have designed and no engineer would have drawn and no neighbor would have recommended. Burl walked past all of them and lay down against the hearthstone with the ease of an animal that has found the warmest place in a room and intends to stay there. Harlan was quiet for a long time. Then he said he supposed he had better help her dig out the north door. He did not say anything else about the wall that day. He did not say anything about what he had told people in October. He dug for 2 hours and drank the coffee Ruth made and ate a piece of the bread still warm from the pan. And when he and his men left in the early afternoon, he paused at the door and looked back at the stone wall one more time. He built something like it the following autumn. He did not ask Ruth for instructions. He watched her wall the next time he was in the cabin, and he asked questions about the clay mix and the void in the upper section. Practical questions, the kind a man asks when he has decided a thing is worth understanding. Ruth answered every question. The wall stood in that cabin for another 40 years, through 3 more families and 2 expansions of the original structure. When the cabin was eventually dismantled in 1913, the mason hired for the work paused over the interior stone wall and asked who had built it. The family who owned the property then did not know the name. They said it was old They said it had always been there. The mason pressed his hand against the stone. It was summer, and the wall was cool in a way that dense stone is cool in summer. The same physics, the same patience, the same unwillingness to simply give up what has been given. He said it was good work. He said whoever built it knew what they were doing. The valley remembered the blizzard of 1874 for many years. Ruth Calloway remembered the warmth. This story is a historical narrative reconstruction inspired by frontier building practices of the 1870s plains. It is presented for educational and storytelling purposes only. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.